the case of Gaza, with the case of Palestine. And we know that in the aftermath of the so-called ceasefire, Trump's ceasefire, how do you see the situation right now in Gaza? How do you see the way that, I don't know if there is any sort of pressure coming from the regional countries to the United States and the foreign policy of the United States, but after all, how do you find it? How do you see the current situation in Gaza?
Well, I'm glad you said so-called ceasefire because, contrary to the very carefully scripted lies of politicians and their enablers and complicit media corporations, the genocide in Palestine has not ended. There is no ceasefire, and there is no peace process, really. Just hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza have been murdered by the Israeli regime since the so-called ceasefire was declared a month ago. Hundreds more have been horribly wounded. Hundreds of homes and other civilian structures have been destroyed by the Israeli regime during this period of the so-called ceasefire. Thousands of truckloads of food and medicine and shelter and other essentials have been blocked by the regime. And in fact, there has not been a single day since the ceasefire ruse began that Israel has ceased firing or ended its genocidal siege of Gaza. Not one single day. And still, US and Western politicians and media corporations continue to disseminate what is a destructive lie. And at the same time, I have to say, the Israeli regime's genocidal attacks and settler pogroms on the West Bank have not only continued unabated, but in fact, they have accelerated during this period. So anyone who participates in this charade of a ceasefire, so-called by Trump, at this stage is either very naive or willfully complicit in a strategy that is clearly being used by saying there's a ceasefire and there's a peace process. That's a strategy that the US and Israel are using to hide the continuing genocide, to get folks to focus elsewhere while they consolidate control of Gaza, normalize the Israeli regime, and continue to perpetrate the genocide. It's still going on. And, this is, as has been said many, many times, the first live streamed genocide in history. So we all know what is happening on the ground. We know that Israel has systematically destroyed essentially all of Gaza. It has carried out massacres and mass abductions and systematic torture and, the shooting of Palestinian toddlers by snipers for sport, the destruction of all of the necessities of life, the continuing siege, all of this with the specific intent to destroy the Palestinian people, first in Gaza and ultimately all throughout historic Palestine. That did not begin in October of 2023. You merely saw an upsurge of the kind of violence that the Israeli regime has been perpetrating against Palestinians for decades. And it did not end with this declaration of a so-called ceasefire.
For us who are not that much familiar with the United Nations, and we are all the time we are criticizing how the United Nations is somehow trying to face what's going on in the Middle East, in Gaza. But what can they do, in your opinion? We have this U4P, Unity for Peace, and how is that going to help us to be used for the case of Israel and Palestine?
Well, when you talk about the United Nations, you always have to be clear on which United Nations you're talking about. A part of the United Nations has responded to this genocide very well indeed. Here I'm talking about, for example, the independent human rights mechanisms of the UN, like the Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, or the International Commission of Inquiry that has verified that genocide is happening in Palestine, other UN human rights mechanisms, humanitarian actors who've been working hard and taking great risks to deliver some relief to the Palestinian people. And of course, UNRWA workers, those are UN workers, hundreds of whom just during this genocide have been murdered by the Israeli regime, hundreds more terribly wounded, many abducted and tortured in Israeli dungeons. Those are part of the UN as well, and they have been nothing short of heroic during the genocide. But the political side of the House has failed miserably. And here I'm talking about the Secretary General, the senior political leadership of the UN, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and others who not only have not rallied to oppose the genocide, they haven't even dared to say the name of the crime out loud. Instead, when you are asked about it, they'll say something like, well, only a court can determine genocide, which is a nonsense line invented in the hallways of the Secretariat to avoid having to say out loud that Israel is committing genocide, so that they don't take pressure then from the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Israel lobby groups that will harass them endlessly. So they just escape the discussion. And in the process, not only are they denying and abandoning the victims and survivors of the genocide in Palestine, they are abandoning the norms and standards of the organization, of the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the human rights treaties, the findings of the International Court of Justice, which is also a part of the UN. All of that they are dismissing so that they don't have to take criticism from the United States, the United Kingdom, the Germans, the Israel lobby, and others. They have dropped the ball miserably. Now, when you go to the intergovernmental bodies, like the Security Council that a lot of people know about, or the UN General Assembly, there it's another story. The Security Council is an archaic, old, post-World War II Cold War mechanism in which the 5 winners of World War II have veto power. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China all have veto power, which means that if any one of them don't agree to something, it's blocked in the Security Council. And that's why for 2 years of genocide, you've seen the Security Council has done absolutely nothing. It has not called for a ceasefire. It has not mobilized protection for the Palestinian civilians. It has not held Israel accountable. It has not deployed sanctions or an embargo. It has not even suspended the credentials of the Israeli regime as it murders United Nations staff. It has done absolutely nothing because the US and frankly its allies do everything they can to make sure that the Security Council cannot act. That leaves you with the UN General Assembly. Oh, and by the way, I should say, the US has vetoed action throughout this genocide 6 times. And beyond this genocide, it has issued vetoes 50 times, all 50 for the purpose of ensuring impunity for the Israeli regime and its crimes throughout the years. So that brings you to the General Assembly. Now, the General Assembly does have some freedom of action. It also has a global majority that supports Palestine, a supermajority. In fact, in September of 2024, when the General Assembly adopted a historic resolution, basically codifying all of the decisions of the International Court of Justice about the illegality of the Israeli occupation and the demands for Israel to stop its assaults on Gaza, all of that, and giving a 1-year deadline for Israel to comply, that was adopted by like 90% of the member states of the United Nations, against the objections of the US and Israel and a few other extreme allies of that regime. But that deadline expired in September of this year, and nothing has happened to hold Israel accountable. Why? Because Israel's friends in the UN mobilized to create a distraction to prevent Israel from being held accountable by first adopting a French-Saudi proposal called the New York Declaration now, that basically proposes the normalization of Israel even during its genocide, the deploying of a proxy occupation force to Gaza to control not the perpetrator of the genocide, but to control the victims of the genocide, and to force the Palestinians back into a situation where they have to negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, rather than to have the rights guaranteed as the International Court of Justice says they must. And then, of course, Donald Trump issued his own plan in which he basically calls for 19th century US colonization of Gaza on behalf of the Israelis, the further denial of self-determination, the further caging of the people of Gaza, the disarming of the Palestinian resistance, and the continuing normalization of the Israeli regime. And now what's happening in the UN Security Council is that diplomats that support the US and others are now negotiating to try to combine the French-Saudi proposal, which is a colonial plan, with the US proposal, which is a pure 19th century colonial plan, in order to stop all these calls for accountability of the Israeli regime and to further control the Palestinian peoples. In other words, their response to the genocide has been punish the victims, and reward the perpetrator. We've never seen this in the history of the United Nations before. We hope that won't happen. Now, Nima, there is a third track that started even before all of the developments that we've seen, because, for this 2 years of genocide, Israel has literally gotten away with murder. But it is also a 2-year period in which Israel is on trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice. Its leaders are indicted for crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court. It has been found guilty of apartheid by the International Court of Justice. And it has been condemned as guilty of genocide and apartheid by every major international human rights organization, Israeli human rights organizations, Palestinian human rights organizations, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, international lawyers from around the world. There is a global consensus that Israel is perpetrating apartheid and genocide, and a demand that it be held accountable for that. And that track includes a movement to try to get the United Nations General Assembly to go around the US veto in the Security Council by using this old mechanism called Uniting for Peace. Uniting for Peace is a mechanism in the UN General Assembly. Remember, in the General Assembly, there are no P5 permanent members. There's no veto. There's 193 countries. Every country gets one vote, and there's no veto. So Uniting for Peace would allow the General Assembly, the global majority, to decide what happens without being obstructed by the US veto. And under Uniting for Peace, the General Assembly could reject Israel's credentials, call for sanctions, call for a military embargo, establish an accountability mechanism, reactivate the UN's anti-apartheid mechanisms to deal with apartheid inside Israel. And importantly, it could mandate a UN protection force to travel to Gaza, to protect Palestinian civilians from Israeli attacks, to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid throughout Gaza, to preserve evidence of Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity, and to begin the process of reconstruction without interfering with Palestinian governance, Palestinian political rights, just making sure that civilians are protected. And it could be deployed as a consent-based mechanism based on the consent of the Palestinians, not imposed on them against their will as a proxy occupation. And that process has been going on. It's been stalled because of these other initiatives that have pushed it onto the back burner. It's also been stalled because its principal sponsor is President Gustavo Petro of Colombia. And the minute that he announced this, he came under attack from the United States, which pulled his visa, threatened him with sanctions and tariffs, threatened to even overturn his government. So he's under a great deal of pressure now from the US government for daring to stand up to genocide in Palestine. But the idea is still alive. It will be crushed, it seems to me, if the US succeeds in getting the Security Council to mandate this colonial occupation of Gaza. And then we'll be right back to where we were for the past 80 years of the occupation, dispossession, denial of self-determination, and persecution of the Palestinian people while they are forced to beg for their rights with the promise of maybe a Bantustan somewhere down the road.